Hello, my name's Roger Watson and welcome to this session on homeostasis. Homeostasis refers to the body's ability to regulate physiologically its inner environment to ensure its stability in response to fluctuations in the outside environment. Essentially, in health, homeostasis keeps us stable. Homeostasis is really the purpose of physiology. The concept of homeostasis was first articulated by the Frenchman Claude Bernard in the 1860s. And here's Claude Bernard. Bernard said, "I think I was the first to urge the belief that animals have really two environments, a milieu exterior in which the organism is situated and a milieu interior in which the tissue elements live." The term homeostasis was coined by Walter Cannon in 1932. And here's Walter Cannon. And here's what Cannon said. "The coordinated physiological processes which maintain most of the steady states in the organism are so complex and so peculiar to living beings, involving as they may the brain and nerves, the heart, lungs, kidneys and spleen, all working cooperatively, that I've suggested a special designation for these states, homeostasis. The word does not imply something set and immobile, a stagnation. It means a condition which may vary, but which is relatively constant." At this point, I'd urge you to look at the Bozeman biology link on homeostasis on YouTube. Now, to demonstrate homeostasis, we're going to use the idea of a fishbowl. It's not perfect, but it will suffice. In the fishbowl, you've got analogies with the human body and the functions. For example, the water in the fishbowl is like the body fluid, which is the internal environment. The glass bowl is like the skin. It forms a barrier between the internal and external environments. The fish is essentially the cells of the human body, the function of which is to stay alive. The air pump in the fishbowl is the lungs. This keeps the O2 levels constant. There's a filter there, which is like the kidneys. It keeps nitrogenous wastes constant. There's a heater, which is like the muscles. It keeps the temperature constant. A feeder, which is the digestive system analogy, keeps nutrient levels constant, and everything working together leads to relatively constant conditions. Anybody who, of course, keeps fish in a bowl knows it can be quite difficult. You have to keep feeding them and cleaning them. So the analogy is not perfect. The body more or less does all of these things for itself. You only have to feed it. All the rest is taken care of by the physiological homeostatic processes of the body. So how does homeostasis work? Well, it works by feedback. Here's an abstract demonstration of a feedback. You've got any system at the top with an input and an output. The point behind the feedback system is that the output is sensed. Through a feedback system, it feeds back on the input, and it can increase it or decrease it depending on what you want. There's negative feedback and positive feedback. Most of homeostasis takes place with negative feedback. We will look later at an example of positive feedback. Negative feedback and the understanding of negative feedback is crucial to understanding the process of homeostasis. An example of negative feedback is a thermostat. So a thermostat is essentially an engineered control system. It's a good model for looking at homeostasis. So if we look at a thermostatic heating system in a home, we're all familiar with this. and the components thereof. Remember, this works automatically if it's set properly. The variable we're interested here is the temperature in the room. The sensor is a thermometer, specifically a thermostat. It needs some kind of integrator or control center to coordinate the information, to coordinate the sensing of the information and what's done with it, and it needs to be set at a particular point beyond which the temperature shouldn't rise and below which it shouldn't fall. And then there's an effector which enables the changes, in other words, a furnace or an oil heating system which actually provides the temperature. And these components are shown here in this diagram. On the left, the room temperature is picked up by the sensor. If it goes up too far, that's turned off. If it drops, it goes down. A signal is sent to a heater which produces heat. Quite simple. That's a negative feedback system. In the body, essentially we can start at any point. If we start at the top left, if the conditions in the body change from a set point, that change is detected in the body, and there are corrective mechanisms which are activated to return the conditions to the set point, and then the corrective mechanisms are switched off. Bringing in the negative feedback loop here, we can look at this another way. There's some disturbance in the system. For example, if it's temperature, the body gets too hot or too cold, that's sensed, and then it goes to a control system, which in the body would be the brain, and then some control system which enables us to lose heat or to conserve heat, and the variable's regulated. Once it's regulated, there's negative feedback on the sensor, and whatever change was taking place to take that system back to normal stops. So the components of a negative feedback loop are the stimulus, the condition that changes, the receptors that sense the change, the control center, the effectors, and the response. And these are shown together here in this diagram. It's very similar to the other one, but it's just slightly neater. Once the response is obtained through the homeostatic mechanisms from the stimulus, which alters the homeostatic condition, picked up by receptors, goes to the control center. This in the human body is nearly always in the brain. Then there are effectors to make the change, and then a response, and the negative feedback loop is shown there on the left. That feeds back on the stimulus to stop it. So those are abstract examples. Let's look at a real example. And the example I'm going to use here is blood pressure control. And this is summed up in this diagram. If we start at the top left, blood pressure falls. That is sensed by pressure-sensitive receptors called baroreceptors in the carotid artery. This sends nerve signals to a part of the brain, and it's nearly always some part of the brain that's the integrative center in homeostatic systems. This has a set point, so it knows that the blood pressure has fallen. That sends signals out through the sympathetic nervous system to increase cardiac output, which increases blood pressure. And the increase in blood pressure stops the lowering of the blood pressure and stops that system working, and that's called negative feedback. So tying this back into our abstract diagram, the components of a blood pressure negative feedback loop are the stimulus, which is the drop in blood pressure, the condition, which should be a constant blood pressure, receptors, in this case carotid artery baroreceptors, the control center is the brain or some part thereof, the effector is the cardiovascular system, and the response is the increase in blood pressure, which leads to negative feedback and stops the stimulus. If it didn't stop the stimulus, then blood pressure would go on increasing indefinitely and become very dangerous. As I said, there are very few examples of positive feedback. I'll give an example that's not physiological, which is audio feedback. I'm sure we've all been in the presence of a microphone and a speaker at a conference or a wedding or at a rock concert, where the sound from the speakers is picked up by the microphone and then feeds back through the microphone and sets up what's called a feedback loop, leads to a dreadfully high-pitched noise. That's an example of positive feedback. If that's not stopped, it'll continue until the speakers are damaged. And it works like that, by the sound being picked up with the microphone, going through the mixer to the amplifier, coming back out of the speaker, and then being picked up by the microphone again. A physiological example is labour and childbirth. Here's a diagram of a baby being born. In fact, suction seems to be being used here, so it's not a great analogy, but just to make the point. So, labour and childbirth. The fetus's head moves into the birth canal, the vagina, at the start of labour, which causes the birth canal to stretch beyond its set point amount of stretch. This is detected by sensors or stretch receptors in the vaginal wall and fed back to the hypothalamus of the brain. This releases oxytocin, which stimulates stronger and more frequent uterine contractions, which pushes the fetus, which causes more vaginal stretch, which produces more oxytocin, and so on, greatly amplifying and speeding up labour contractions, and it stops at birth. So what happens when homeostasis goes wrong? Well, just about everything. Hypothermia, diabetes, hyperglycemia, hypertension, hemorrhage, acidosis, ketosis, hypoxia, hypercapnia, and so on. These are all examples of deviations from homeostasis. So what compromises homeostasis? Disease, being neonatal, aging, environmental extremes, trauma, malnutrition, drugs and alcohol. So that's a very quick run through homeostasis. This refers to the body's ability to regulate physiologically its inner environment to ensure its stability in response to fluctuations in the outside environment. Now a few questions. 1. Define homeostasis. 2. What are the components of a homeostatic system? 3. Using blood glucose as an example, explain how negative feedback works in the restoration of blood glucose levels after ingesting carbohydrates. 4. Using blood pressure as an example, identify the following: sensor or receptor, control center, effector, variable. 5. Using falling blood pressure as an example, explain how negative feedback works. Thank you very much for listening. This is my email address for any questions or comments. I also have a blog called 4 Things About, a simple approach to anatomy and physiology, and you'll find the answers to the questions there under the entry homeostasis. Once again, thank you very much for listening.